Welcome to a journey through time, to the story of a man who was born into a world of darkness and superstition, yet grew up to illuminate the universe with the brilliant light of reason. It is a cold winter morning on Christmas Day in the year 1642, and in a humble stone farmhouse in the tiny village of Woolsthorpe in Lincolnshire, England, a woman named Hannah gives birth to a son. The child is so small, so impossibly premature, that he could fit inside a quart pot. The midwives shake their heads and whisper among themselves. They have seen many infants like this one, and none have survived. Outside, England tears itself apart in civil war. Inside this simple farmhouse, a miracle is unfolding that will change the course of human history forever. The infant's father, a yeoman farmer also named Isaac, has been dead for 3 months, never knowing that his son would carry his name into immortality. This fragile baby, struggling for each breath in the cold December air, will grow up to explain why apples fall from trees, why planets orbit the sun, and why the ocean tides rise and fall. He will peer deeper into the nature of reality than any human before him. He will literally rewrite the laws of the universe. His name is Isaac Newton, and this is his complete story. Before we embark on this extraordinary journey, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel if you don't want to miss future stories. And I'm genuinely curious where in the world you're watching from tonight. Drop a comment and let me know. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and let us travel back more than 3.5 centuries to witness the birth of modern science itself. The England that Isaac Newton was born into was a nation in chaos. King Charles I was at war with his own parliament, and the entire country had descended into a brutal civil war that would eventually see the monarch beheaded and the kingdom transformed into a commonwealth under Oliver Cromwell. Villages were burned, families were torn apart, and ancient certainties crumbled as the medieval world gave way to something new and terrifying. In the countryside, far from the political upheavals of London, life was harsh and short. Disease was rampant. Medicine was primitive. Most children did not survive to adulthood. Superstition governed the minds of ordinary people. Witches were hunted and burned. Comets were seen as omens of divine wrath. The idea that the universe operated according to mathematical laws that humans could discover and understand would have seemed not just unlikely, but actively heretical to most people of that time. The village of Woolsthorpe, where Isaac was born, consisted of perhaps a dozen families scattered across the rolling farmland of Lincolnshire. The Newton family owned a manor house, though calling it a manor gives perhaps too grand an impression. It was a solid stone building, larger than a cottage, but nothing compared to the estates of the nobility. The Newtons were what we might call successful farmers, not wealthy, but comfortable by the standards of rural England in the 17th century. Hannah Ascott Newton was a strong woman who had to be strong to survive in that harsh world. She had married Isaac Newton Sr. when she was in her early 20s, a respectable match for a woman of her background. But her husband's death just months into their marriage left her alone, pregnant, and responsible for managing the farm and household. When her son was born so prematurely that his survival seemed impossible, Hannah refused to give up on him. She nursed him through those critical first weeks and months, coaxing him to live when everyone else had written him off as lost. For 3 years, mother and son lived together in the Woolsthorpe manor. We can only imagine what those years were like, but we know they formed a bond that would profoundly affect Isaac's character. He was a sickly child, often ill, always small for his age. But he was also intensely curious, observing everything around him with unusual focus. The servants later remembered him as a quiet boy who asked strange questions and spent hours watching how sunlight moved across the floor or how water flowed in the streams near the house. When Isaac was 3 years old, his world shattered. Hannah remarried, choosing a wealthy rector named Barnabas Smith, who was more than 30 years her senior. Reverend Smith was willing to marry the widow and take on the responsibility of her household, but he had one absolute condition. He would not have the boy in his house. Isaac, was to be left behind at Woolsthorpe with his maternal grandmother, Marjorie Ayscough, while his mother moved to the nearby village of North Witham to begin her new life. The abandonment was devastating. At the age when a child most needs his mother, Isaac was separated from the one person who had fought to keep him alive. He watched her leave with her new husband, not understanding why she was going, not understanding why he could not come. His grandmother did her best to care for him, but she was elderly and had her own responsibilities managing the farm. Isaac grew up feeling unwanted, rejected, different from other children who had both parents in secure places in their families. This early trauma would mark Newton for the rest of his life in ways both obvious and subtle. He became a solitary child, then a solitary man. He learned not to trust others completely, not to form close attachments that might be torn away. He developed an intense need to prove himself, to demonstrate his worth through achievement, since he could not rely on family connections or social position, and he cultivated a fierce independence of mind, questioning everything, accepting nothing on authority alone. The little boy left with his grandmother in Woolsthorpe developed early signs of the genius that would later astound the world. He built elaborate mechanical toys, water clocks that actually kept time, windmills that really turned in the breeze, sundials carefully calibrated to track the sun's path across the sky. He drew pictures with startling precision and showed an intuitive grasp of mechanical principles that amazed the few people who paid attention to the quiet, odd child. But he also showed signs of deep emotional damage. Years later, when he was a young man examining his conscience and recording his sins, he wrote in his private notebook a chilling entry. Among his confessions was this: threatening my father and mother Smith to burn them and the house over them. The rage was there, buried deep but burning hot, directed at the stepfather who had taken his mother away and at the mother who had chosen her new husband over her son. When Isaac was 10 years old, Reverend Barnabas Smith died, and Hannah returned to Woolsthorpe bringing with her 3 children from her second marriage, a boy and 2 girls who had enjoyed the mother's love and attention that Isaac had been denied for 7 formative years. The reunion was awkward and painful. Isaac had learned to live without his mother. Now she was back, but she was no longer entirely his. He had half-siblings who were strangers to him, children who had never been abandoned, who had always known they were wanted. The family dynamics were complicated and troubled, reinforcing Isaac's sense of being different, of being outside normal human relationships. Hannah Newton was a practical woman who expected her eldest son to take over the family farm and continue the work that his father and grandfather had done. She pulled him out of the local grammar school where he had been learning Latin and basic mathematics and brought him home to learn farming. It was a complete disaster. Isaac had absolutely no interest in agriculture, and even less talent for it. He was supposed to watch the sheep, but the servants found him reading under a tree while the flock wandered into the neighbours' fields. He was supposed to learn about crops and livestock management, but instead he built elaborate mechanical contraptions and filled notebooks with mathematical calculations. He was caught reading when he should have been at the market, drawing diagrams when he should have been mending fences. Hannah's brother, William Ayscough, was a clergyman who had been educated at Cambridge University. He recognised that his nephew was wasting away in the countryside, that this strange, brilliant boy was meant for something far beyond farming. William convinced his sister that Isaac should return to school, arguing that the boy had talents that deserved to be developed. Hannah reluctantly agreed, perhaps relieved to send her difficult eldest son away again. At the age of 14, Isaac returned to the King's School in Grantham, about 7 miles from Woolsthorpe. The school had been founded in the 16th century to provide classical education to boys from the area. Students studied Latin and Greek, learned rhetoric and logic, and received the foundation in ancient languages and literature that was considered essential for any educated person. For most boys, the King's School was preparation for university or for careers in the church or law. For Isaac Newton, it became the place where his intellectual powers truly began to awaken. He lodged with the local apothecary, a man named Clark, who had a shop full of fascinating chemicals, instruments, and books. The apothecary's house became Isaac's laboratory, where he could experiment with mixing compounds, observe chemical reactions, and read about natural philosophy in Clark's extensive library. He also developed his first romantic attachment to Clark's stepdaughter, a girl named Catherine Storer. It was an innocent adolescent infatuation, but it was perhaps the only romantic feeling that Newton would experience in his entire life. He never married, never had children, never formed intimate relationships as an adult. That young love in the apothecary's house in Grantham was as close as he would come. At the King's School, Isaac excelled at his studies with an intensity that amazed his teachers. He mastered Latin and Greek far beyond what was expected. He read voraciously, everything from classical authors to contemporary works on mathematics and science. But what really set him apart was his mechanical ability and his mathematical thinking. He could solve complex problems that baffled other students. He could visualize geometric relationships that others could not see. He built working models of machines with extraordinary precision, showing an intuitive understanding of forces, motion, and mechanical advantage that suggested a mind capable of extraordinary things. The headmaster of the King's School, Henry Stokes, recognized that he had an exceptional student. When the time came to consider university, Stokes personally intervened to ensure that Isaac would have his chance at Cambridge. He tutored the boy in additional subjects, prepared him for the entrance requirements, and even lobbied Isaac's mother to support her son's continued education. Hannah was skeptical about the value of university for a boy who was meant to be a farmer, but eventually she was persuaded. The family could afford the fees, barely, and perhaps university would make Isaac into a successful professional who could support his mother in her old age. In June of 1661, at the age of 18, Isaac Newton arrived at Trinity College, Cambridge, carrying a small trunk with his few possessions and a burning determination to prove himself in this ancient institution of learning. Cambridge, in the middle of the 17th century, was a strange mixture of medieval tradition and emerging modern ideas. The university had been founded in the 13th century, and many of its customs and practices had changed little since then. Students still wore academic gowns at all times. Lectures were delivered in Latin. The curriculum was dominated by Aristotelian philosophy and scholastic theology that emphasized the authority of ancient texts over direct observation of nature. Most professors taught exactly what had been taught for generations, content to preserve and transmit traditional knowledge, rather than discover anything new. Into this conservative environment walked a young man who would question everything and overturn the ancient certainties that the university existed to defend. Newton entered Trinity College as a subsizar, the lowest category of student. Subsizars were essentially servants to wealthier students, performing menial tasks in exchange for their education. Isaac cleaned the rooms of richer classmates, served their meals, ran errands, and endured their condescension. For a young man already marked by feelings of abandonment and social inferiority, the experience must have been humiliating, but it also reinforced his determination to succeed on his own merits, to rise above his circumstances through the force of his intellect alone. While other students spent their evenings drinking, gambling, and socializing, Newton buried himself in books and study. He read not just the assigned texts, but works that pushed the boundaries of contemporary knowledge. His notebooks from these early years at Cambridge reveal a mind awakening to its own extraordinary power. He began to question Aristotelian physics, asking fundamental questions that his professors could not answer. Why do objects fall toward the Earth? What keeps the planets in their orbits? How does light produce the sensation of color in our eyes? These were dangerous questions in a university that still officially taught that the Earth was the center of the universe, and that all knowledge worth having was contained in ancient texts. Newton read the works of René Descartes, the French philosopher and mathematician who argued that the universe operated like a vast machine according to mathematical laws that human reason could discover. He studied Galileo Galilei, the Italian scientist who had dared to point a telescope at the heavens and discovered moons orbiting Jupiter, proving that not everything in the cosmos revolved around the Earth. He absorbed the ideas of Johannes Kepler, who had derived mathematical laws describing planetary motion. All of these thinkers were challenging the ancient world view, and Newton drank in their ideas eagerly. But Newton did not simply accept new ideas because they were new, any more than he accepted old ideas because they were old. From the very beginning, he insisted on working things out for himself, testing ideas through mathematical calculation and, where possible, through experiment. His early notebooks show him grappling with fundamental problems in mathematics and natural philosophy, often arriving at insights that professional mathematicians and scientists had not yet achieved. He taught himself advanced mathematics by reading the works of contemporary mathematicians and then pushing beyond what they had done, developing new techniques and methods that would eventually revolutionize the field. In 1664, during Newton's third year at Cambridge, bubonic plague swept through England with terrifying speed and deadly efficiency. The disease had been a periodic scourge for centuries, but this outbreak was particularly severe. Cities became death traps as the plague spread through crowded streets and homes. Cambridge University, recognizing the danger, shut down and sent students home to wait out the epidemic. For most students, this was a frustrating interruption to their education. For Isaac Newton, it became the most productive period of his entire life, a miraculous 18 months, during which he made discoveries that would transform human understanding of the natural world. Newton returned to Woolsthorpe in the summer of 1665, a young man of 22 with a bachelor's degree but no clear prospects. The manor house where he had spent his unhappy childhood became his laboratory, his observatory, his private universe. Alone in the countryside, free from the distractions and obligations of university life, Newton's mind exploded with creativity and insight. He later described this period as the prime of my age for invention, and he was not exaggerating. During those 18 months at Woolsthorpe, Newton invented calculus, one of the most powerful mathematical tools ever created. Calculus allows mathematicians to calculate rates of change, to find areas under curves, to solve problems involving motion and accumulation that had baffled thinkers for thousands of years. Newton developed it because he needed it to solve problems in physics and astronomy that could not be addressed with existing mathematics. He called his version the method of fluxions, and he worked out its fundamental principles entirely on his own, though he would not publish his results for many years. Independently, a German mathematician named Gottfried Leibniz would later develop calculus using different notation, leading to a bitter priority dispute that would poison the last decades of Newton's life. During the plague years at Woolsthorpe, Newton also conducted groundbreaking experiments on the nature of light. Using a glass prism that he had purchased at a country fair, he discovered that white sunlight is actually composed of all the colours of the rainbow mixed together. When white light passes through a prism, it separates into its component colours, a phenomenon Newton studied with meticulous care. He conducted experiment after experiment, using multiple prisms, lenses, and screens to trace exactly how light behaved. His discoveries contradicted the prevailing theory, which held that prisms somehow added colour to white light. Newton proved that the colours were already present in the light itself, that white light was a mixture and not a pure substance. This was a revolutionary insight that would eventually lead to his theory that light consists of tiny particles, an idea that would compete with the wave theory of light for centuries, until quantum mechanics revealed that light has properties of both particles and waves. And during those miraculous months at Woolsthorpe, Newton began to work out his theory of universal gravitation, the idea that the same force that causes an apple to fall from a tree also keeps the moon in orbit around the Earth and the planets in orbit around the sun. The story of the apple falling from the tree while Newton sat in the garden is probably true in essence, though the details have been embellished over the years. Newton himself told the story in his old age, describing how seeing a falling apple had set him thinking about the nature of gravity and whether its power extended all the way to the moon. Newton realized that if gravity could pull an apple to the ground, then logically it must also pull on the moon. But the moon does not fall to Earth because it is also moving sideways, fast enough that it continuously falls around the Earth rather than into it. This insight, simple as it sounds, was revolutionary. It meant that the heavens and the Earth obeyed the same laws of nature, that there was no fundamental difference between celestial and terrestrial phenomena. The ancient distinction between the perfect, unchanging realm above the moon and the imperfect, changing realm below was abolished in a single stroke of insight. Newton worked out the mathematics of orbital motion, deriving from first principles the laws that Kepler had discovered empirically. He showed that if gravity decreased with the square of distance, then planetary orbits would be ellipses, exactly as Kepler had observed. But he could not yet prove this rigorously, and he set the problem aside for later. These discoveries, any one of which would have made Newton famous, were not published or even shared with other scholars. Newton kept them to himself, recording his results in private notebooks that no one else saw. This secrecy was partly due to his natural reticence and distrust of others. But it was also because Newton was a perfectionist who wanted to work out every detail, answer every objection, and present a complete and polished theory before exposing his ideas to criticism. This tendency to hoard his discoveries and publish only reluctantly would characterize his entire career, leading to bitter disputes about priority and credit. In 1667, the plague subsided and Cambridge University reopened. Newton returned to Trinity College, no longer a student, but as a fellow, a junior member of the academic staff. The position came with a small stipend and rooms in the college, but more importantly, it gave him time and freedom to continue his research. Over the next few years, Newton built on the foundations he had laid during the plague years, developing his ideas further and beginning to share some of his results with other mathematicians and natural philosophers. In 1669, at the age of just 26, Newton was appointed Lucasian Professor of Mathematics, one of the most prestigious academic positions in England. His predecessor in the chair, Isaac Barrow, had recognized Newton's extraordinary abilities and stepped aside to allow the younger man to take the position. As Lucasian Professor, Newton was required to deliver lectures on mathematics and to deposit written versions of his lectures in the university library. His lectures were notoriously difficult and often poorly attended. Newton made no effort to make his material accessible to ordinary students. He presented his ideas in their full mathematical rigor, assuming a level of knowledge and dedication that few of his students possessed. Many of his lectures were delivered to nearly empty rooms, but Newton did not seem to care. He was pursuing truth, not popularity. During his early years as Lucasian Professor, Newton built the first practical reflecting telescope, a device that used mirrors instead of lenses to magnify distant objects. Existing telescopes used lenses, which suffered from chromatic aberration, the same effect that Newton had studied with prisms. Different colours of light refract by different amounts when passing through glass, so lens-based telescopes produced images with coloured halos that limited their usefulness. Newton's reflecting telescope avoided this problem entirely by using a curved mirror to focus light, producing much clearer images. He built a small version, only about 6 inches long, that performed as well as much larger lens-based telescopes. When he demonstrated his invention to the Royal Society of London, the premier scientific organisation in England, they were astonished and immediately elected him to membership. It seemed like Newton had finally gained the recognition and respect that his genius deserved. But his relationship with the scientific community would prove far more complicated than he could have imagined. In 1672, flush with success from his election to the Royal Society, Newton published his first scientific paper describing his experiments on light and colours. He expected that his careful experiments and mathematical reasoning would convince everyone of his conclusions. Instead, the paper triggered a storm of criticism and controversy. Robert Hooke, a brilliant scientist who was curator of experiments for the Royal Society, attacked Newton's theory vigorously. Hooke believed that light was a wave, not a stream of particles as Newton suggested, and he criticised Newton's experimental methods and conclusions. Other natural philosophers joined in, raising objections and proposing alternative explanations. Newton, who was hypersensitive to criticism and had shared his work reluctantly in the first place, was devastated. He had expected rational debate based on evidence and logic, but instead he faced personal attacks and misrepresentations of his ideas. The experience confirmed all of Newton's worst instincts about sharing his discoveries. He withdrew from public scientific debate, nursing his grievances and vowing to avoid publication in the future. For years, he focused on his private research, conducting alchemical experiments in his rooms at Trinity College, studying ancient texts for hidden wisdom, and pursuing theological investigations that would have been heretical if anyone had known about them. Newton had discovered through his reading of the Bible and early Christian writings that he could not accept the doctrine of the Trinity, the idea that God exists as three persons in one being. This made him technically a heretic according to the Church of England, a dangerous position for someone who held a university post that required him to take holy orders. Newton managed to obtain a special dispensation exempting him from this requirement, but he kept his religious views strictly secret, knowing that public knowledge of his anti-Trinitarian beliefs could destroy his career. In 1679, Robert Hooke, now Secretary of the Royal Society, wrote to Newton trying to re-establish communication and draw the reclusive mathematician back into scientific discourse. Hooke asked Newton's opinion about planetary motion and whether an inverse square law of gravitational attraction could explain Kepler's laws. Newton responded with cool courtesy, but made a small error in one of his examples, which Hooke pointed out. This minor embarrassment seems to have reignited Newton's interest in the problem of orbital mechanics. He returned to the work he had begun during the plague years and pushed it much further, working out the full mathematical theory of gravitational attraction. Then, in 1684, the astronomer Edmund Halley came to Cambridge with a question. Halley had been discussing planetary motion with Hooke and the architect Christopher Wren, and they had convinced themselves that an inverse square law of gravity would produce elliptical orbits, but none of them could prove it mathematically. Halley asked Newton what path a planet would follow if pulled toward the sun by a force that decreased with the square of distance. Newton immediately answered that the orbit would be an ellipse. Halley was astonished and asked how he knew this. Newton replied that he had calculated it years before. When Halley asked to see the calculation, Newton could not find his papers immediately, but promised to send them later. This visit from Halley proved to be the crucial catalyst that would lead to Newton's greatest work. Halley recognized that Newton had solved one of the most important scientific problems of the age, and he urged Newton to work up his results into a proper treatise for publication. Newton, finally persuaded that his work was important enough to justify the effort and risk of publication, threw himself into writing with manic intensity. For the next 2 years, Newton worked almost without rest, barely eating or sleeping, consumed by the task of presenting his theory of universal gravitation in complete mathematical form. The result was the Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica, the mathematical principles of natural philosophy, usually just called the Principia. Published in 1687 with Halley's financial backing and enthusiastic support, the Principia is arguably the most important scientific book ever written. In it, Newton laid out his 3 laws of motion, laws that describe how objects move in response to forces. The first law states that an object at rest stays at rest, and an object in motion stays in motion at constant velocity unless acted on by a force. The second law states that force equals mass times acceleration. The third law states that for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. These laws, so simple in their formulation, were revolutionary in their implications. They applied to all objects everywhere, from falling apples to orbiting planets. They were universal laws that governed all motion in the universe. Newton then introduced his law of universal gravitation, stating that every object in the universe attracts every other object with a force proportional to their masses and inversely proportional to the square of the distance between them. Using this simple law and his three laws of motion, Newton derived Kepler's laws of planetary motion from first principles. He explained the tides as resulting from the gravitational pull of the moon and sun on the Earth's oceans. He showed why the Earth is not a perfect sphere, but slightly flattened at the poles. He explained the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble in the Earth's axis of rotation. He worked out the motion of comets and showed that they too obeyed his gravitational law. The Principia was written in Latin and presented with rigorous mathematical proofs in the style of Euclidean geometry. It was difficult to read, deliberately so. Newton wanted to avoid controversy with people who would criticize without understanding, so he made his book as technically demanding as possible to discourage casual readers. But for those who could follow his reasoning, the Principia was a revelation. Newton had done something unprecedented in human history. He had shown that the same laws that govern objects on Earth also govern the motions of the heavens. He had unified terrestrial and celestial mechanics into a single, elegant mathematical framework. He had demonstrated that the universe operates according to discoverable mathematical laws, not according to the whims of spirits or gods. The impact of the Principia on European thought cannot be overstated. Here was proof that human reason could penetrate the deepest mysteries of nature, that the universe was not arbitrary and chaotic, but orderly and comprehensible. The success of Newton's physics inspired thinkers in every field to search for universal laws governing their domains. Philosophers sought to establish ethics on a rational foundation. Political theorists tried to discover the natural laws of government. Economists looked for mathematical regularities in markets and trade. The entire Enlightenment project of establishing reason as the supreme authority in human affairs traces back to Newton's demonstration that reason could unlock the secrets of the cosmos. Newton became famous throughout Europe as the man who had explained the system of the world, but fame brought its own problems. In 1693, Newton suffered what appears to have been a serious mental breakdown. He stopped sleeping regularly, became paranoid and erratic, and wrote strange, accusatory letters to friends. The exact cause is uncertain. Some historians have suggested mercury poisoning from his alchemical experiments. Others point to the enormous stress of his scientific work combined with his natural tendency toward obsession and isolation. Whatever the cause, Newton recovered after several months, but he was never quite the same. The man who had revolutionized physics in his 20s and 30s was now in his 50s, and his creative powers, while still formidable, had passed their absolute peak. In 1696, Newton's life took an unexpected turn when he was appointed Warden of the Royal Mint in London. This was primarily an administrative position, overseeing the production of coins and the prosecution of counterfeiters. Most people in Newton's position would have treated it as a sinecure, collecting the salary while doing minimal work. But Newton, constitutionally incapable of doing anything halfway, threw himself into reforming the mint with the same intensity he had brought to physics. He personally investigated counterfeiters, gathering evidence and sending men to the gallows for debasing the currency. He oversaw a complete recoinage of England's money, replacing worn and clipped coins with new ones of proper weight and fineness. In 1699, he was promoted to Master of the Mint, a position he would hold for the rest of his life, and which made him a wealthy man. Newton moved to London permanently leaving Cambridge and his academic career behind. He never married, but he set up a household with his niece Catherine Barton, who served as his hostess and companion. Catherine was beautiful, witty, and socially accomplished, everything that Newton was not. Through her, Newton maintained social connections and navigated the complex world of London society. In 1703, Robert Hooke died, and Newton was elected president of the Royal Society. He would hold this position for the rest of his life, dominating English science with the same autocratic control that he had applied to the Mint. Newton could be generous to those who acknowledged his supremacy, but he was ruthlessly vindictive toward anyone he perceived as challenging his priority or his ideas. The last decades of Newton's life were marked by an increasingly bitter dispute with Gottfried Leibniz over who had invented calculus first. Both men had developed calculus independently, Newton earlier, but publishing later, Leibniz later, but publishing first. A reasonable resolution would have acknowledged both as independent inventors, but Newton could not tolerate sharing credit. He used his position as president of the Royal Society to orchestrate a campaign against Leibniz, appointing a committee to investigate the dispute and then writing its report himself, naturally concluding that he had priority and that Leibniz was a plagiarist. The controversy consumed enormous amounts of Newton's time and energy in his later years and damaged his reputation for scientific objectivity. In 1704, Newton finally published his other great work, the Optics, describing his experiments on light and colour in detail. Unlike the Principia, the Optics was written in English and was much more accessible to general readers. It became a bestseller and spread Newton's ideas about light throughout Europe and beyond. The book included a series of queries, questions about nature that Newton posed but did not fully answer, covering topics from the nature of heat to the possibility that light and matter might be interconvertible. These queries inspired generations of researchers and pointed the way toward discoveries that would not be fully understood for centuries. As Newton aged, he became a revered figure, the personification of scientific genius. Visitors came from across Europe to meet the great man. He was consulted on everything from mathematics to theology to the proper design of the British currency. In 1705, Queen Anne knighted him in recognition of his services to science and to the Mint, making him Sir Isaac Newton, the first scientist ever to be knighted for his scientific work. But beneath the public honours and acclaim, Newton remained the solitary, suspicious man he had always been. He never married, never formed truly intimate friendships, never let down his guard completely with anyone. His niece Catherine cared for him dutifully, but we do not know what she thought of her famous uncle. His correspondence shows a man who could be gene, arouse, and helpful to young scientists who flattered him, but who never forgot a slight and pursued vendettas with relentless determination. In his final years, Newton's health declined. He suffered from gout, kidney stones, and the general infirmities of old age. But his mind remained sharp, almost to the end. He continued to attend meetings of the Royal Society and the Mint, continued to correspond with mathematicians and natural philosophers across Europe, continued to work on revisions of his books and on theological investigations that he would never publish. On March 20th, 1727, Isaac Newton died in his sleep at his home in London at the age of 84. He was given a state funeral and buried in Westminster Abbey, among England's kings and heroes. The poet, Alexander Pope, composed a famous epitaph, "Nature and nature's laws lay hid in night. God said, 'Let Newton be,' and all was light." It was a fitting tribute to a man who had illuminated the universe with the light of reason and mathematical understanding. But Newton's legacy is more complicated than Pope's neat couplet suggests. He had indeed revealed fundamental laws of nature and shown that the universe operates according to mathematical principles that human minds can discover and understand. He had created the modern scientific method, combining mathematical theory with experimental testing in ways that proved extraordinarily powerful and productive. He had established the framework for physics that would serve for more than 2 centuries, until Einstein showed that Newton's laws, while extremely accurate for everyday situations, are approximations to a deeper relativistic reality. Yet Newton himself was a far stranger and more complicated figure than the rational scientist of popular imagination. He spent more time on alchemy and theology than on physics, searching for hidden divine wisdom in ancient texts and chemical experiments. His religious views, which he kept carefully secret, were heretical by the standards of his time. He believed that the universe demonstrated God's existence and wisdom, but he rejected key Christian doctrines, including the Trinity and the divinity of Christ. For Newton, God was the great architect who had designed the cosmic machine and set it running according to mathematical laws. Newton's scientific legacy was immediately apparent and continues to shape our world. His laws of motion and gravitation enabled precise prediction of planetary positions, comet orbits, and tides. Engineers applied his principles to design machines, buildings, and vehicles. His mathematics became the foundation for all subsequent physics and much of engineering. His emphasis on experimental verification and mathematical analysis became the model for how science should be conducted. Every scientist who formulates a theory in mathematical terms, who designs experiments to test predictions, who insists on quantitative evidence, is following the path that Newton laid out. But Newton's personal legacy is more troubling. He demonstrated that scientific genius does not necessarily correlate with wisdom about human affairs or with emotional intelligence. The man who could see into the deep structure of the universe could not see into the hearts of other people or even his own heart. He pursued priority disputes with vicious intensity, using his authority to destroy rivals and claim exclusive credit for discoveries. He lived in isolation, trusting no one, forming no deep human connections. The lonely child, abandoned by his mother, grew into a lonely old man who had conquered the cosmos but remained locked inside himself. Modern scholars studying Newton's vast collection of unpublished manuscripts have revealed a thinker far more complex than the rational scientist of legend. His alchemical experiments, once dismissed as an embarrassing aberration, are now understood as serious attempts to understand the deep structure of matter and its transformations. His theological investigations, far from being a hobby separate from his science, were deeply connected to his physical theories. For Newton, discovering the laws of nature was a way of reading God's mind, of understanding the divine intelligence that had designed the cosmos. Newton believed that the universe was a kind of coded message from God to humanity, a message written in the language of mathematics. By deciphering this message, by working out the mathematical laws that govern natural phenomena, Newton thought he was uncovering divine truth. This theological motivation for his science seems strange to modern secular sensibilities, but it was fundamental to Newton's own understanding of what he was doing. He famously said that if he had seen farther than others, it was by standing on the shoulders of giants, acknowledging his debt to earlier thinkers. But he also said that he felt like a boy playing on the seashore, finding a smoother pebble or prettier shell than ordinary, while the great ocean of truth lay all undiscovered before him. This combination of pride in his achievements and humility before the vastness of what remained unknown was characteristic of Newton's complex personality. The scientific revolution that Newton completed had profound implications beyond science itself. It established a new way of understanding humanity's place in the universe. Before Newton, most people lived in a cosmos full of meaning and purpose, where earthly events reflected heavenly influences, where nature was alive with spirits and intentions, where humans were the central concern of creation. After Newton, the educated classes increasingly saw the universe as a vast machine operating according to impersonal mathematical laws. where humans were just one species on one planet, orbiting one star in an inconceivably large cosmos, where there was no evidence of purpose or design beyond the mechanical operation of natural law. This shift from an enchanted cosmos to a mechanical universe was liberating in many ways. It freed people from superstitious fears, enabled technological progress, and established reason as the ultimate authority. But it was also deeply unsettling, removing the sense of cosmic meaning and purpose that had sustained people for millennia. The existential questions raised by the Newtonian worldview continue to challenge us today. If the universe is just a machine operating according to mathematical laws, what room is there for human freedom, moral choice, or spiritual meaning? These questions would occupy philosophers, theologians, and scientists for centuries after Newton's death. The immediate practical impact of Newton's work was enormous. Astronomers using his gravitational theory could predict planetary positions far more accurately than ever before. They calculated the return of comets, correctly forecasting when Halley's Comet would reappear. They discovered new planets by observing tiny irregularities in known planetary orbits, irregularities that could only be explained by the gravitational influence of unknown bodies. Engineers applied Newton's laws of motion to design more efficient machines, stronger bridges, and taller buildings. His mathematical methods became the standard tools for any kind of quantitative analysis. The success of Newtonian physics inspired what we might call physics envy in other fields. If Newton could reduce the motions of planets to simple mathematical laws, why could not human behavior, social organization, and economic activity also be explained by universal laws? This hope drove much of Enlightenment thought, leading to the emergence of social sciences that attempted to apply scientific methods to human affairs. Political economists like Adam Smith looked for natural laws governing markets. Sociologists sought universal principles of social organization. Even historians began to think that there might be laws of historical development waiting to be discovered. This dream of achieving Newtonian certainty in human affairs has never been fully realized. Human behavior proved far more complex and unpredictable than planetary motion. But the attempt to apply scientific thinking to social and political questions has profoundly shaped the modern world, for better and worse. Newton's influence extended into philosophy in ways that he might not have anticipated or approved. His success in using mathematics to describe nature seemed to prove that reality was fundamentally mathematical, that the universe was a kind of geometric structure. This supported a rationalist view of knowledge, the idea that pure reason could discover truths about the world without relying entirely on sense experience. But it also raised difficult questions. How can we know that our mathematical descriptions actually correspond to reality? Might there be aspects of nature that cannot be captured in mathematical language? These epistemological questions became central to philosophy in the centuries after Newton. Immanuel Kant argued that space and time were not features of reality itself, but rather the framework that human minds impose on experience. He thought that Newtonian physics was necessarily true because it described the structure of human perception, not because it described an independent external reality. Other philosophers drew different conclusions, but Newton's physics became the test case that any theory of knowledge had to accommodate. In the 19th century, Newton's physics faced its first serious challenges. Astronomers discovered tiny anomalies in Mercury's orbit that could not be explained by Newtonian gravitation. Experiments on the speed of light produced results that seemed inconsistent with Newton's assumptions about absolute space and time. These problems culminated in 1905 when Albert Einstein published his special theory of relativity, showing that space and time are not absolute and independent as Newton had assumed, but relative and interconnected. In 1915, Einstein's general theory of relativity replaced Newton's law of gravitation with a radically different picture in which gravity is not a force, but a curvature of space-time itself. Einstein's theories showed that Newton's laws, while extremely accurate for everyday situations, are approximations that break down at very high speeds or in very strong gravitational fields. The replacement of Newtonian physics with Einsteinian relativity was a dramatic demonstration that even the most successful scientific theories can be overturned when better evidence and better theories emerge. But it did not diminish Newton's achievement. His laws remain excellent approximations for almost all practical purposes. We still use Newtonian mechanics to design buildings, predict tides, and calculate rocket trajectories. Newton's mathematical methods remain fundamental to physics and engineering, and perhaps most importantly, Newton established the basic approach of modern physics, using mathematics to formulate theories and experiments to test them. In this sense, Einstein was following Newton's method, even while overturning Newton's specific conclusions. The quantum revolution that began in the early 20th century posed even deeper challenges to the Newtonian worldview. Quantum mechanics showed that at the atomic scale, nature is fundamentally probabilistic rather than deterministic. The exact prediction of future states from present conditions, which Newton had made possible for planetary motion, is impossible in quantum mechanics. You can calculate probabilities, but you cannot predict with certainty what will happen in any individual case. This was deeply disturbing to many physicists, including Einstein, who famously objected that God does not play dice with the universe. But experiment after experiment confirmed the quantum predictions, showing that the ultimate nature of reality is far stranger than Newton or anyone in his era could have imagined. Yet even quantum mechanics uses mathematical tools that Newton helped develop. Calculus, differential equations, and linear algebra are as essential to quantum theory as they are to classical mechanics. The mathematical description of nature that Newton pioneered remains the foundation of physics, even though the specific laws have been revised and expanded in ways that Newton never anticipated. Looking back over the more than 3 centuries since Newton's death, we can see him as a pivotal figure in human history, someone whose work fundamentally changed how we understand our place in the universe. Before Newton, most people saw themselves as living in a meaningful cosmos, where earthly events reflected heavenly influences, and where nature was full of purposes and intentions. After Newton, educated people increasingly saw the universe as a vast machine, operating according to impersonal mathematical laws that had nothing to do with human concerns. This transformation in worldview enabled the scientific and technological progress that has so dramatically changed human life. But it also created the sense of alienation and meaninglessness that has haunted modern culture. We have had enormous power over nature through applying the scientific method that Newton exemplified. But we have lost the sense of cosmic belonging that earlier humans took for granted. This is perhaps the deepest legacy of the Newtonian revolution, and we are still working out its implications today. Newton's personal life reminds us that genius and wisdom are not the same thing. He was extraordinarily successful at uncovering the mathematical laws of nature, but he was far less successful at understanding himself or forming healthy human relationships. The abandoned child who grew up feeling unwanted developed extraordinary intellectual powers, but remained emotionally stunted throughout his life. His inability to trust others, his obsessive secrecy, his vindictive pursuit of rivals, all stemmed from wounds inflicted in childhood that his brilliant mind could never heal. This raises uncomfortable questions about the price of greatness. Did Newton's emotional isolation contribute to his scientific success by allowing him to focus with unusual intensity on abstract problems? Or did his psychological wounds hold him back from even greater achievements by making him waste energy on priority disputes and preventing him from fully collaborating with other talented thinkers? We cannot know, but Newton's example suggests that intellectual brilliance and emotional health are not necessarily connected. Modern biographers painting a more complete picture of Newton have uncovered aspects of his work that earlier accounts ignored or downplayed. His alchemical experiments, far from being an embarrassing deviation from his serious science, were extensive and carefully conducted. Newton spent more years on alchemy than on physics, filling notebooks with detailed observations of chemical reactions and reflections on the transformation of matter. He seems to have believed that alchemy might reveal secrets about the fundamental structure of reality that mechanical physics could not access. Newton's theological writings, which fill millions of words in unpublished manuscripts, reveal a mind deeply concerned with religious questions. He studied ancient texts, trying to recover what he believed was the pure, original Christianity, before it had been corrupted by later additions, like the doctrine of the Trinity. He made detailed calculations about biblical chronology, trying to establish exact dates for events in sacred history. He interpreted prophecies in the books of Daniel and Revelation, trying to understand God's plan for human history. For Newton, science and religion were not separate domains, but different approaches to understanding the same divine truth. This integration of scientific and religious thinking seems foreign to modern sensibilities, which tend to keep these domains strictly separate. But for Newton and his contemporaries, there was no contradiction. Studying nature was a way of studying God's creation and thereby learning about the Creator. The mathematical laws that governed planetary motion were evidence of divine intelligence and design. The order and beauty of the cosmos pointed to a rational, benevolent God who had structured reality according to mathematical principles that humans, made in God's image, could understand. Yet Newton's God was not the God of traditional Christianity. Newton rejected the Trinity, the divinity of Christ, and many other standard doctrines. His God was more like a cosmic architect who had designed the universe and set it running according to perfect laws. Once created, the universe operated mechanically according to those laws, with God intervening only rarely, if at all, to correct small irregularities and keep the system running smoothly. This deistic conception of God would become increasingly popular among educated Europeans in the 18th century, in part because of Newton's enormous prestige. The religious implications of Newton's physics were debated throughout the 18th century. Some saw his work as demonstrating God's existence and wisdom through the perfect mathematical order of creation. Others worried that his mechanical universe left no room for providence, miracles, or answered prayers. If the universe was a machine operating according to fixed laws, what role was there for a personal God who cared about individual humans and intervened in history? These theological debates became entangled with political and social questions. Newton's physics seemed to support a constitutional monarchy or even a republic rather than absolute monarchy. If the universe was a lawful system rather than an expression of arbitrary divine will, perhaps human government should also be based on law rather than the arbitrary will of kings. The political implications of Newtonian science were complex and contested, but the general trend was toward more democratic and constitutional forms of government. In the realm of ethics and social philosophy, Newton's influence was equally profound and equally complicated. If humans were just complex machines operating according to natural laws, what became of free will and moral responsibility? If the universe was morally neutral, operating according to mathematical principles, without any inherent purpose or value, where did ethical obligations come from? These questions challenged traditional foundations for morality and forced philosophers to search for new justifications for ethical behavior. Some Enlightenment thinkers argued that morality, like physics, must be based on reason and universal principles, rather than on religious authority or cultural tradition. They tried to discover natural laws of ethics that would be as certain and universal as Newton's laws of motion. Others worried that the mechanical worldview undermined any possible foundation for morality, leaving humans adrift in a meaningless universe with no objective basis for distinguishing right from wrong. The Industrial Revolution that transformed Europe and eventually the entire world in the 18th and 19th centuries was built on Newtonian foundations. Engineers applying Newton's laws of motion and his mathematical methods designed the steam engines, factories, and transportation systems that revolutionized production and commerce. The mathematical analysis of forces, energies, and efficiencies made possible the systematic improvement of technology in ways that would have been impossible without Newtonian physics. This technological transformation brought enormous improvements in material living standards for many people, but also created new problems including pollution, urban overcrowding, and the exploitation of industrial workers. The question of whether the benefits of scientific and technological progress outweigh the costs is still debated today, but there is no doubt that Newton's physics played a crucial role in enabling the modern industrial world with all its achievements and problems. In the realm of education, Newton's influence led to major changes in how mathematics and science were taught. His work demonstrated the power of mathematical reasoning and experimental investigation, leading to greater emphasis on these subjects in schools and universities. The traditional curriculum based on classical languages and literature was gradually supplemented and in some cases replaced by training in mathematics and natural science. This shift reflected the growing conviction that scientific and technical knowledge was more valuable and more useful than classical learning. The spread of Newtonian physics to continental Europe was facilitated by popularizers who translated his difficult Latin text into more accessible forms and explained his ideas in simpler language. Voltaire and Émilie du Châtelet produced an influential French exposition of Newtonian physics. Similar works appeared in German, Italian, and other languages, spreading Newton's ideas far beyond the small circle of mathematicians who could read the original Principia. By the mid-18th century, Newtonian physics had become the dominant scientific paradigm throughout Europe, replacing older Cartesian and Aristotelian frameworks. The success of Newton's physics inspired attempts to create similarly successful theories in other domains. Just as Newton had reduced planetary motion to mathematical law, could not human psychology, social organization, and historical development also be explained by universal laws? This hope drove the emergence of social sciences in the 18th and 19th centuries. Economists tried to discover laws governing production and exchange. Sociologists looked for principles explaining social structure and change. Psychologists searched for laws of mental functioning. These disciplines achieved varying degrees of success, but none matched the precision and predictive power of Newtonian physics. The complexity of human affairs resisted the kind of mathematical reduction that worked so well for planetary motion. Yet the attempt to apply scientific methods to human behavior has profoundly shaped the modern world, creating new forms of knowledge and new techniques of social control. In the arts and literature, Newton's influence was equally profound, though more indirect. The Newtonian universe, governed by mathematical law and devoid of inherent meaning, posed challenges for artists and writers who wanted to represent human experience as meaningful and significant. The Romantic movement in art and literature can be seen partly as a reaction against the mechanical, mathematical worldview associated with Newtonian physics. Romantic poets and artists emphasized emotion, imagination, and spiritual experience against what they saw as the cold rationalism of science. They celebrated nature not as a machine to be analyzed, but as a living presence to be experienced and revered. This tension between scientific and artistic approaches to understanding reality has persisted to present day. Some artists and writers have embraced scientific knowledge and incorporated it into their work. Others have positioned themselves as defenders of human values and experiences that science cannot capture or explain. Newton himself was aware that his mathematical analysis of nature abstracted from the full richness of direct experience. He compared himself to a boy playing on the seashore while the great ocean of truth lay undiscovered before him. This humility before the vastness of what remained unknown contrasts sharply with some of his followers who thought that Newtonian methods could eventually explain everything. The dream of a complete mathematical description of all natural phenomena, a theory of everything that would leave no mysteries unsolved, has motivated physicists from Newton's time to the present. This dream has never been fulfilled, and perhaps cannot be fulfilled, but the pursuit of it has led to extraordinary discoveries and deep insights into the nature of reality. Newton's legacy in mathematics is as significant as his legacy in physics. His development of calculus provided a powerful tool for analyzing change and motion, enabling solutions to problems that had baffled earlier mathematicians. The notation and methods he developed have been refined and extended by generations of mathematicians. But the fundamental concepts remain the foundation of mathematical analysis. His work on infinite series, on the binomial theorem for non-integer exponents, on the classification of curves, and on many other mathematical topics, opened new areas of investigation and established techniques that are still used today. His approach to mathematics, combining algebraic and geometric reasoning, solving problems by inventing new methods when existing techniques proved inadequate, exemplifies the creative mathematical thinking that drives the field forward. In the history of science, Newton stands as perhaps the greatest example of individual genius transforming human understanding. Other scientists have made comparably important discoveries. Darwin's theory of evolution, Einstein's relativity, and the quantum mechanics of Bohr, Heisenberg, and Schrödinger are intellectual achievements on the same order as Newton's gravitation and optics. But none of these later scientists worked in such isolation or accomplished so much with so little in the way of institutional support and existing knowledge to build on. Newton created modern physics almost single-handedly, developing both the mathematical tools and the physical concepts needed to describe nature in mathematical terms. This extraordinary achievement set the standard for what science could accomplish and inspired generations of researchers to tackle fundamental questions about the natural world. Yet Newton's success also created problems that science is still grappling with. His physics encouraged a reductionist approach to understanding nature, the idea that complex phenomena can be explained entirely in terms of simpler components and mathematical laws. This reductionism has been enormously successful in physics and chemistry, enabling us to explain the behavior of matter in terms of atoms, molecules, and fundamental particles. But when applied to biology, psychology, and social phenomena, pure reductionism seems to miss something essential. Living organisms, conscious minds, and human societies have properties that may not be fully explainable just by analyzing their component parts. The question of whether everything can ultimately be reduced to physics, or whether there are reducible levels of organization and explanation, remains controversial and unresolved. Newton himself was not a simple-minded reductionist. He recognized that his gravitational force was mysterious, that he could calculate its effects but did not understand what it really was, or how it worked. His famous statement, "I do not feign hypotheses," was a refusal to speculate about the underlying mechanism of gravity. He was content to describe mathematically how gravity behaved without claiming to explain its ultimate nature. This methodological humility, focusing on what could be measured and calculated rather than what could only be speculated about, was an important part of Newton's scientific approach and contributed to his success. The Newtonian conception of absolute space and time, which Einstein's relativity theory overturned, was based on Newton's belief that space and time provided the fixed stage on which physical events occurred. Newton thought that there must be an absolute frame of reference, even if we could not access it directly through observation. This metaphysical commitment to absolute space and time went beyond what his physics strictly required and turned out to be wrong. But it did not prevent his physics from being extraordinarily successful for more than 2 centuries. This illustrates an important point about scientific theories. They can be highly successful, even if some of their philosophical assumptions turn out to be mistaken. What matters for scientific success is accurate prediction and explanation of phenomena, not necessarily correct metaphysical foundations. Newton's physics has been superseded by Einstein's relativity and quantum mechanics, but it remains an excellent approximation for a vast range of phenomena. We still use Newtonian mechanics to design cars and bridges, to send spacecraft to the planets, to predict tides and planetary positions. For most practical purposes, Newton's laws are perfectly adequate and far simpler to apply than relativistic or quantum theories. This illustrates another important point about scientific progress. New theories do not necessarily show that old theories were completely wrong, but rather specify the domains where the old theories work well and the domains where they break down and need to be replaced. In reflecting on Newton's life and legacy more than 3 centuries after his death, we can appreciate both his extraordinary achievements and his very human limitations. He revealed fundamental laws of nature and created the mathematical framework for describing them. He established the modern scientific method of combining mathematical theory with experimental testing. He showed that the universe operates according to discoverable rational principles, not according to arbitrary whim or supernatural intervention. These achievements transformed human civilization, enabling the technological progress that has so dramatically changed our material existence and our understanding of our place in the cosmos. Yet Newton the man was flawed and troubled, marked by childhood trauma, unable to form intimate relationships, obsessively secretive and prone to vicious priority disputes. The abandoned child who learned not to trust anyone grew into a lonely adult who conquered the secrets of the heavens, but remained locked in emotional isolation. His life reminds us that intellectual brilliance does not guarantee personal happiness or wisdom in human affairs. The tension between Newton's extraordinary scientific achievements and his difficult personality raises questions about the nature of genius. Is exceptional intellectual ability somehow connected to psychological problems? Does dedication to abstract thought come at the cost of emotional connection? The answer is probably no. Many great scientists have been personally well-adjusted and emotionally healthy. But Newton's example shows that genius and wisdom are different qualities that do not necessarily go together. The baby born on Christmas Day in 1642, so small and weak that he seemed certain to die, lived for 84 years and changed the world more profoundly than perhaps any other single individual in history. From his solitary childhood in Woolsthorpe to his final years as the revered president of the Royal Society, Newton followed a path that was uniquely his own, driven by curiosity, by ambition, by the need to prove himself, and by a genuine desire to understand how God's creation worked. His legacy continues to shape our world in countless ways, from the physics we teach in schools to the technology we use every day, from the scientific method we take for granted to the existential questions we still struggle with about meaning and purpose in a mathematical universe. As we close this story of Isaac Newton's life, we can recognize him as a pivotal figure in human history, someone who fundamentally changed how we understand reality. The universe before Newton was a mysterious, often frightening place full of incomprehensible forces and arbitrary events. The universe after Newton was a rational, orderly system operating according to mathematical laws that human minds could discover and understand. This transformation in worldview is Newton's greatest legacy, one that continues to unfold in ways that even his extraordinary genius could not have anticipated. The premature infant who should have died became immortal through his ideas, which have outlived him by centuries and will continue to shape human thought for as long as our species endures. To truly understand Newton's revolutionary impact, we must explore in greater depth how his methods and discoveries transformed not just physics, but the entire intellectual landscape of Europe and eventually the world. The scientific revolution that culminated in Newton's work represented far more than simply the discovery of new facts about nature. It represented a fundamental shift in how humans approach the acquisition of knowledge itself. Before this revolution, knowledge was primarily sought through consultation of ancient authorities and through logical deduction from first principles. If you wanted to know how nature worked, you read Aristotle or other classical authors and reasoned from their premises. Direct observation of nature was considered less reliable than rational thought because the senses could be deceived. Newton's approach inverted this hierarchy. For him, observation and experiment were primary, while theory and mathematics were tools for organizing and explaining what observation revealed. This empirical emphasis did not mean abandoning mathematics or rational thought. On the contrary, Newton's genius lay precisely in his ability to combine mathematical rigor with careful observation in a way that had never been achieved before. He would observe a phenomenon carefully, such as the splitting of white light into colors by a prism. Then he would conduct systematic experiments to test different possible explanations. Finally, he would formulate a mathematical description of the phenomenon that could make precise predictions about what would happen in new situations. This cycle of observation, experiment, mathematical formulation, and prediction became the template for all subsequent physics. The power of Newton's method can be seen most clearly in his work on gravitation. Earlier thinkers had speculated about forces that might keep planets in their orbits, but their speculations remained vague and qualitative. Newton transformed the question by asking precisely what mathematical form a gravitational force would need to have in order to produce the elliptical orbits that Kepler had discovered empirically. By assuming an inverse square law, he could derive Kepler's laws mathematically and show that the same force that pulled objects to Earth also governed celestial motions. This was an extraordinary synthesis, bringing together terrestrial physics and astronomy into a single unified framework. But Newton did not stop there. He tested his theory by making predictions that could be verified. He calculated what the gravitational pull of the moon should be and showed that it matched the observed tides. He explained the slight flattening of the Earth at the poles as a result of its rotation combined with gravitational forces. He predicted that comets, which many people still saw as supernatural omens, were simply celestial bodies following paths determined by the same gravitational law as planets. When Halley's comet returned in 1758, 16 years after Halley's death and 31 years after Newton's, exactly as Newton's theory predicted, it was dramatic confirmation of the power of mathematical physics. This prediction and verification cycle established a new standard for scientific knowledge. It was no longer enough to have plausible explanations or coherent theories. A proper scientific theory had to make precise, quantitative predictions that could be tested against observation. If the predictions matched reality, the theory gained credibility. If they did not match, the theory had to be revised or abandoned regardless of how elegant or reasonable it might seem. This insistence on empirical testing sounds obvious to modern ears, but it was revolutionary in Newton's time, and it took generations to be fully accepted even among educated people. Newton's optical experiments demonstrated his empirical method perhaps even more clearly than his work on gravitation. The prevailing theory in Newton's youth, advocated by Descartes and others, held that white light was pure and simple, while colors were modifications of white light caused by interactions with matter. When white light passed through a prism, according to this theory, the glass somehow modified it to produce colors. This seemed reasonable and fit with the Aristotelian idea that complex phenomena arise from modifications of simple, pure substances. Newton's experiments proved this theory wrong. He showed that when white light passes through a prism and separates into a spectrum of colors, those colors can be recombined by a second prism to produce white light again. If the prism had modified the light to create colors, this recombination should not be possible. More dramatically, Newton showed that once light had been separated into its component colors, passing a single color through another prism produced no further change. If prisms modified light to create color, then a second prism should modify it further, but it did not. Therefore, white light must already contain all colors, and the prism merely separates them rather than creating them. These experiments were simple in principle, but devastating in their implications. They show that what seemed obviously true, that white light was pure and simple, was actually false. They demonstrated that nature could only be understood through careful experiment rather than through reasoning from apparently self-evident premises. And they established a methodology that scientists have followed ever since, designing experiments to test between competing theories and accepting results even when they contradict intuition. Newton's mathematical innovations were equally revolutionary, and perhaps even more important in the long run than his specific discoveries in physics. When he began his serious scientific work during the plague years at Woolsthorpe, the mathematics available to him was inadequate for dealing with motion and change. Classical geometry could handle static shapes and proportions beautifully, but it struggled with phenomena that varied continuously over time. Algebraic methods developed in the Renaissance could solve certain kinds of problems involving changing quantities, but they were limited in scope and clumsy in application. Newton needed better tools to analyze motion, acceleration, and the rates at which quantities change. So he invented those tools, creating what we now call calculus. The fundamental insight of calculus is that continuously changing quantities can be analyzed by considering their behavior over infinitesimally small intervals. If you want to find the speed of a falling object at a particular instant, you cannot simply divide distance traveled by time elapsed, because both are zero at a single instant. But you can consider the distance traveled over a very small time interval, calculate the average speed during that interval, and then let the interval become smaller and smaller. The limit of this process, as the interval approaches zero, is the instantaneous speed. This concept of a limit, rigorously defined and systematically applied, is the foundation of differential calculus. The inverse problem, finding the total change in a quantity when you know its rate of change at each instant, leads to integral calculus. If you know the speed of an object at every instant, you can calculate the total distance it travels by adding up all the tiny distances covered in each infinitesimal time interval. This process of infinite summation, again rigorously defined through the concept of a limit, allows calculation of areas, volumes, and accumulated changes of all kinds. Newton developed these techniques between 1665 and 1666 and used them extensively in his work on physics. But he did not publish his method for many years, partly because he was secretive by nature, and partly because he had not yet worked out all the technical details to his satisfaction. Meanwhile, the German mathematician Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz independently invented calculus in the 1670s, developing it from somewhat different starting points and using different notation. Leibniz published his results in the 1680s, before Newton published his. When Newton finally did publish his method of fluxions in the early 1700s, a bitter dispute erupted over who deserved credit for inventing calculus. Newton's supporters claimed that Leibniz had plagiarized Newton's unpublished work. Leibniz's supporters pointed out that Leibniz had published first and had developed his calculus independently. Newton used his position as president of the Royal Society to orchestrate a campaign against Leibniz, appointing a committee to investigate the dispute and then secretly writing the committee's report himself, which naturally concluded that Newton had priority and Leibniz was a fraud. The controversy was ugly and did no credit to either side, though Newton's behavior was particularly vindictive. The real loser was mathematics itself, as British mathematicians remained loyal to Newton's notation and methods, while continental mathematicians used Leibniz's superior notation, and the two communities largely stopped communicating for nearly a century. With hindsight, we can see that both men deserved credit for independent invention, and that Leibniz's notation was better suited for further development. Modern calculus uses Leibniz's symbols while incorporating insights from both inventors. The priority dispute, while personally important to Newton and professionally damaging to mathematics, does not diminish the achievement. Calculus is one of the most powerful intellectual tools ever created, enabling solutions to countless problems in physics, engineering, economics, and many other fields. Whether Newton or Leibniz or both deserve credit, the invention of calculus ranks among the supreme achievements of human thought. Beyond calculus, Newton made numerous other mathematical discoveries that advanced the field in important ways. He developed methods for finding approximate solutions to equations that could not be solved exactly, techniques that are still used in numerical analysis today. He proved the binomial theorem for fractional and negative exponents, vastly expanding the range of problems that could be attacked algebraically. He studied infinite series, showing how functions could be represented as sums of infinitely many terms, and using these representations to calculate values to any desired degree of accuracy. He classified curves according to their algebraic properties and studied their geometric features systematically. These mathematical investigations were not mere abstract exercises for Newton. Each technique was developed to solve some specific problem in physics or astronomy. But once developed, the mathematical methods took on lives of their own, suggesting new questions and opening new areas for investigation. This interplay between mathematics and physics, with each field stimulating advances in the other, became a characteristic feature of subsequent science. Physics raised questions that required new mathematics to answer, while new mathematical techniques enabled physicists to formulate and solve previously intractable problems. The relationship continues to this day, with modern physics depending on sophisticated mathematics and mathematical research often motivated by physical applications. Newton's influence on Enlightenment thought extended far beyond science and mathematics into philosophy, politics, and even theology. The success of his physics seemed to demonstrate that human reason, properly applied, could unlock the deepest secrets of nature. If the motions of the planets could be reduced to mathematical law, what limits were there to what reason might achieve? This confidence in human rationality became the hallmark of Enlightenment thinking, influencing everything from political philosophy to religious belief. In political theory, Newton's physics suggested that the universe was governed by law rather than by arbitrary will. Enlightenment thinkers extrapolated this idea to human government, arguing that states should be governed by law rather than by the whims of monarchs. John Locke, who knew Newton personally and admired his work, developed a theory of natural rights and limited government that drew on the idea of natural law derived from Newton's physics. If the physical world operated according to rational principles discoverable by human reason, might not the same be true of the political world? The American and French revolutions were inspired in part by Enlightenment political philosophy that had roots in the Newtonian worldview. The opening words of the American Declaration of Independence, invoking the laws of nature and of nature's God, reflect the influence of Newtonian thinking. The revolutionaries believed they were establishing government on a rational foundation consistent with natural law, much as Newton had based physics on mathematical principles derived from natural phenomena. This political application of scientific reasoning was not always successful or beneficial. The attempt to create perfectly rational political systems sometimes led to terrible consequences, as the terror during the French Revolution demonstrated. Human societies turned out to be far more complex and unpredictable than planetary systems, and abstract rational principles could not capture the full reality of human needs, passions, and traditions. But the ideal of government based on rational principles, rather than tradition or divine right, remained influential and helped shape modern democratic institutions. In religion, Newton's impact was equally profound and even more controversial. His physics seemed to some people to prove God's existence and wisdom by revealing the mathematical perfection of creation. The clockwork universe, operating according to precise laws, appeared to require a divine clockmaker who had designed it and set it in motion. Natural theology, the attempt to demonstrate religious truths through reason and observation of nature, flourished in the century after Newton's death, with many authors arguing that the order and complexity of the natural world could only be explained as the work of an intelligent designer. But to other thinkers, Newton's mechanical universe seemed to leave no room for God at all, or at best relegated God to the role of remote first cause with no ongoing involvement in creation. If the universe was a machine that ran according to fixed laws, what need was there for divine providence, miracles, or answered prayers? This deistic conception of God as cosmic architect, who created the world and then left it to run on its own, became increasingly popular among educated Europeans in the 18th century, partly as a result of Newtonian physics. Newton himself would have been horrified by this interpretation of his work. He was deeply religious in his own heterodox way and believed that his physics revealed God's attributes and actions. He thought that gravity itself might be evidence of God's continuous activity in the universe, maintaining order and preventing the celestial system from running down. In later editions of the Principia, he added a general scholium arguing that the perfection of the solar system proved the existence of an intelligent creator. He wrote that this most beautiful system of the sun, planets, and comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being. For Newton, scientific investigation was a form of religious devotion, a way of reading God's thoughts and understanding divine wisdom as expressed in the mathematical structure of creation. But Newton's personal theological views were far more radical and dangerous than most of his contemporaries knew. Through extensive study of the Bible and early Christian texts, Newton had concluded that the doctrine of the Trinity, the idea that God exists as three persons in one being, was a later corruption of original Christianity. He believed that Jesus was subordinate to God the Father, not equal to him, and that the Holy Spirit was not a distinct person of the Godhead. These Arian beliefs, named after an early Christian heretic, were completely unacceptable to the established Church of England and would have destroyed Newton's career if they had become public knowledge. Newton kept his theological views strictly secret, sharing them only with a few trusted correspondents. He refused to take holy orders as required for his position at Cambridge, obtaining a special dispensation that exempted him from this requirement. He filled thousands of pages with theological and biblical studies that he never published. Only after his death, when his papers were examined, did it become clear how far his religious thought had diverged from orthodox Christianity. This double life, publicly conforming to the established church while privately holding heretical beliefs, reflects the conflicted position of religion in the scientific revolution. Newton saw no contradiction between his physics and his faith, but his faith was not the traditional Christianity of his time, and his physics would contribute to the erosion of traditional religious authority, even though that was not his intention. The broader cultural impact of Newton's work manifested in countless ways throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. In literature, poets and writers grappled with the implications of the Newtonian worldview. Alexander Pope's famous epitaph for Newton captured the sense that one man had brought light into darkness by revealing nature's laws. But other writers worried that the mechanical universe left no room for poetry, imagination, or human meaning. William Blake, the Romantic poet and artist, portrayed Newton as a symbol of arid rationalism that measured and calculated but missed the living essence of reality. Blake's famous image of Newton sitting naked on a rock at the bottom of the sea, using a compass to draw geometric diagrams, expressed the romantic critique that scientific sea analysis deadens the spirit and blinds us to higher truths accessible only through imagination and emotion. This tension between scientific and poetic ways of knowing became a major theme in modern culture. Some writers and artists enthusiastically embrace scientific knowledge and try to incorporate it into their work. Others position themselves as defenders of human values and experiences that science could not capture. The debate continues today in disputes about the relationship between sciences and humanities, between quantitative and qualitative understanding, between analysis and synthesis. Newton's legacy is bound up with these ongoing cultural tensions, as his work established the modern scientific worldview that some celebrate and others lament. In education, Newton's influence was transformative. Before his work, university curricula focused primarily on classical languages, literature, rhetoric, and scholastic philosophy. Mathematics and natural philosophy, when taught at all, were minor subjects. After Newton demonstrated the power of mathematical physics, these subjects gained enormously in prestige and importance. By the late 18th century, mathematics and science were becoming central to education for anyone who wanted to understand the modern world. This shift towards scientific and technical education accelerated through the 19th and 20th centuries, transforming universities, and eventually earlier stages of education as well. The professionalization of science was another long-term consequence of Newton's work. In his lifetime, natural philosophy was pursued mostly by gentlemen amateurs who had the leisure and means to conduct investigations. There were few professional positions for scientists and little institutional support for research. The Royal Society, of which Newton became president, was a voluntary association of interested individuals rather than a professionalized research organization. But the spectacular success of Newtonian physics demonstrated the value of systematic scientific investigation and gradually led to greater institutional support. Universities created professorships in mathematics and natural philosophy. Governments established observatories and laboratories. Scientific journals provided venues for publishing research results. By the 19th century, science was becoming a profession with established career paths, training programs, and standards for evaluating work. This transformation from amateur natural philosophy to professional science was driven in large part by the success of the Newtonian research program, which showed that systematic investigation could produce valuable knowledge and useful applications. Newton's method of combining mathematical theory with experimental observation became the model for scientific investigation across many fields. In chemistry, researchers sought to discover quantitative laws governing chemical reactions and to develop mathematical theories of chemical combination. In biology, naturalists collected and classified specimens systematically, looking for underlying patterns and principles. In geology, investigators tried to work out the history of the Earth through careful observation of rocks and fossils. Not all of these efforts achieved the kind of mathematical precision that characterized physics, but all were inspired by the Newtonian ideal of discovering natural laws through systematic observation and rational analysis. The extension of scientific methods to the study of human beings and societies raised new and difficult questions. Could human behavior be explained by natural laws like the motion of planets? Were consciousness, free will, and moral choice compatible with a mechanical worldview where everything follows from prior causes according to fixed laws? These questions troubled many thinkers and still trouble us today. The rise of social sciences in the 19th century represented an attempt to apply scientific methods to human affairs. Auguste Comte argued that sociology could become a positive science, like physics, discovering laws of social development and enabling rational social planning. Karl Marx claimed to have found scientific laws of historical change and economic organization. Early psychologists tried to establish laws of mental functioning through experimental investigation. These ambitious projects achieved mixed results. Human behavior proved far more complex and context-dependent than planetary motion. The precision and predictability of physics could not be matched in social sciences. Nevertheless, the attempt to study human beings scientifically has produced valuable knowledge and useful applications, even if it has not achieved Newtonian certainty. Modern social sciences acknowledge that their laws are statistical and approximate rather than exact and universal, but they continue to pursue the Newtonian ideal of systematic empirical investigation guided by theoretical frameworks. The question of whether everything, including human consciousness and culture, can ultimately be explained scientifically remains controversial. Some scientists and philosophers believe that continued research will eventually produce complete explanations of all phenomena in terms of physics, chemistry, and biology. Others argue that human experience has qualities that cannot be fully captured by scientific methods, that there are limits to what can be known through measurement and calculation. Newton himself recognized limits to human knowledge. Despite his extraordinary achievements, he remained humble about how much remained unknown. His comparison of himself to a boy playing on the seashore, while the great ocean of truth lay undiscovered before him, expressed genuine awe at the vastness of what he did not understand. This humility has not always characterized his followers, some of whom have shown excessive confidence in science's ability to answer all questions and solve all problems. The technological applications of Newtonian physics accumulated over centuries, transforming human civilization in ways that Newton could not have imagined. In his own lifetime, the practical applications of his work were limited. His reflecting telescope was useful for astronomy. His mathematical methods helped solve some practical problems in navigation and engineering. But the full technological impact of his physics emerged only gradually as later generations applied his principles to new problems. The Industrial Revolution of the late 18th and 19th centuries was built on Newtonian foundations. Steam engines operated according to principles of mechanics and thermodynamics that could be analyzed using Newtonian methods. Factories were designed using mathematical analysis of forces, materials, and machine performance. Transportation systems, from canals to railroads, relied on engineering that applied Newtonian physics to practical problems. The systematic application of scientific knowledge to technological development, which has become such a dominant feature of modern civilization, began with the recognition that Newton's mathematical description of nature could guide practical action as well as theoretical understanding. In the 20th century, technologies based on non-Newtonian physics emerged. Relativity theory enabled the development of GPS systems that must account for time dilation effects to maintain accuracy. Quantum mechanics made possible transistors, lasers, and all the electronic technologies that define the modern world. These advanced technologies went beyond Newton's physics, but they still followed the method that Newton had established of using mathematical theory to guide experimental investigation and practical application. Even technologies that required new physics still depended on Newtonian methods and approaches. The computer revolution, which has transformed human life in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, rests ultimately on Newtonian foundations. Computers are deterministic machines whose operations follow precise, logical, and mathematical rules. The idea that complex processes can be broken down into simple, rule-governed steps owes much to the mechanistic worldview that Newton's physics established. Of course, modern computers are far more complex than anything Newton encountered, and their theoretical foundations include contributions from logic, mathematics, and engineering that go far beyond Newtonian physics. But the confidence that complex systems can be understood and controlled through systematic application of rational principles descends directly from Newton's achievement. The environmental challenges facing humanity today present an ironic twist in Newton's legacy. The technological civilization that his physics helped enable has created problems that threaten the natural systems on which human life depends. Climate change, driven by fossil fuel consumption, exemplifies how scientific knowledge can produce both benefits and dangers. The same scientific methods that enabled us to exploit nature effectively have also revealed the damage we are causing and the risks we face. Addressing environmental problems requires sophisticated scientific understanding of complex systems, but it also requires wisdom about values and priorities that science alone cannot provide. This points to a fundamental limitation of the Newtonian approach. Physics can tell us what is and how things work, but it cannot tell us what ought to be or how we should live. The mechanical universe that Newton revealed operates without intrinsic purpose or value. It provides no guidance about what goals humans should pursue or what kind of life is worth living. These questions require moral philosophy, political judgment, and cultural wisdom that go beyond scientific expertise. The separation of facts and values, of how things are from how things should be, became increasingly sharp in the centuries after Newton as science came to be seen as value-neutral description of reality. This separation has created ongoing tensions in modern culture. We rely on science for knowledge about the world, but we must look elsewhere for meaning and purpose. We use scientific methods to develop powerful technologies, but we need wisdom and judgment to decide how those technologies should be used. The Newtonian revolution gave us unprecedented power over nature, but it did not give us guidance about how to use that power responsibly. These challenges suggest that while Newton's scientific achievements were extraordinary, they represent only one dimension of human understanding. We also need philosophy, art, literature, religion, and other forms of knowledge to fully comprehend our existence and make wise choices about our future. The tendency to see science as the only legitimate form of knowledge and to dismiss other approaches as mere opinion or superstition represents a misunderstanding of science's proper scope and an impoverishment of human culture. Newton himself, despite his scientific genius, drew on multiple sources of understanding. He studied ancient texts for wisdom. He pursued alchemy, hoping to discover truths that mechanical philosophy could not reveal. He investigated theology extensively, believing that understanding God's nature and purposes was as important as understanding physical laws. Modern secular culture has often tried to separate Newton the scientist, whose work we celebrate, from Newton the alchemist and theologian, whose other investigations seem embarrassing or irrelevant. But this separation distorts Newton's own understanding of what he was doing. For him, all these investigations were aspects of a single quest to understand reality in its fullness, both its physical mechanisms and its deeper meaning and purpose. Recognizing Newton's multifaceted intellectual life reminds us that even the greatest scientist in history saw limits to what scientific methods alone could discover. This perspective is particularly valuable today when we face complex problems that require integrating scientific knowledge with ethical judgment, aesthetic sensitivity, and political wisdom. Climate change, biotechnology, artificial intelligence, and many other challenges raise questions that science illuminates but cannot fully answer. We need Newton's commitment to rigorous investigation and his insistence on empirical testing. But we also need the humility he showed in recognizing that human knowledge is limited and the universe contains mysteries that our current methods cannot penetrate. The story of Newton's life reminds us as well that intellectual achievement and personal fulfillment are not the same thing. Newton solved the riddles of planetary motion and explained the nature of light, achievements that would have satisfied anyone's ambition. Yet he remained throughout his life an isolated, unhappy man who could not form close relationships or find peace with himself. His childhood abandonment created wounds that all his intellectual triumphs could not heal. He died wealthy, famous, and honored, but he died alone in the emotional sense, having never married, never had children, never experienced the intimacy and connection that give life its deepest meaning for most people. This tragic dimension of Newton's story raises uncomfortable questions about the costs of greatness. Did his emotional isolation contribute to his scientific success by allowing single-minded focus on abstract problems? Or did it hold him back from even greater achievements by preventing him from collaborating effectively with other talented minds? We cannot know. But Newton's example certainly suggests that genius and happiness are independent qualities, that someone can be extraordinarily successful in one dimension of life while failing in others. Modern society often measures success primarily in terms of achievement and recognition, but Newton's life suggests that this is a limited and potentially misleading standard. A life can be highly successful by conventional measures while remaining deeply unfulfilled in human terms. Conversely, someone who makes no great discoveries or achieves no public recognition might live a rich, meaningful, and deeply satisfying life through relationships, experiences, and personal growth. These reflections on Newton's personal life are not meant to diminish his scientific achievements. His contributions to human knowledge remain extraordinary regardless of his personal struggles. But they do remind us to maintain perspective about what matters most in human existence. Scientific progress is valuable and important, but it is not the only value, or even necessarily the highest value. Human connection, compassion, wisdom, justice, beauty, and meaning all deserve attention and cultivation alongside the pursuit of knowledge. As we conclude this long journey through Isaac Newton's life and legacy, we can appreciate him as a complex, contradictory figure whose achievements and failures both offer lessons for us today. He showed that human reason, rigorously applied, can discover truths about nature that previous generations never imagined. He demonstrated that mathematics provides a powerful language for describing reality. He established methods of investigation that continue to guide scientific research. These are permanent contributions that have enriched human civilization immeasurably. Yet Newton also showed the limits of pure intellect. The abandoned child who grew into the greatest scientist of his age never found the emotional fulfillment that might have made him truly happy. His bitter priority disputes, his paranoid suspicions, his inability to trust or be trusted, all stemmed from psychological wounds that his brilliant mind could neither understand nor heal. In this sense, Newton's life is a cautionary tale about the importance of attending to our full humanity, not just our intellectual capacities. We need both the head and the heart, both reason and compassion, both knowledge and wisdom. The universe that Newton revealed to us operates according to mathematical law, indifferent to human concerns and aspirations. Yet we are not indifferent. We find meaning in relationships, in creative expression, in moral striving, in spiritual seeking. The mechanical world that Newton discovered is the stage on which human drama unfolds, but the drama itself cannot be reduced to physics and mathematics. We are part of nature, subject to its laws, but we are also more than mere machines. Consciousness, intentionality, values, and purposes remain real and important, even in a universe that physics describes completely in terms of matter, energy, and mathematical relationships. Newton's physics does not diminish human significance, but it does relocate it. We are not the center of a cosmos designed for our benefit, but we are conscious beings capable of understanding the cosmos and choosing how to respond to what we understand. That capacity for comprehension and choice gives human existence its meaning and dignity. Newton showed us that we can understand the universe. The question now is whether we can use that understanding wisely, whether we can combine knowledge with wisdom, power with responsibility, rational analysis with ethical sensitivity. These challenges require more than Newton's physics can provide, but they build on the foundation he established. The infant born on Christmas Day in 1642, so small that he could fit in a quart pot, grew up to become a giant whose shadow still stretches across human civilization. His discoveries transformed our understanding of reality. His methods established how systematic investigation should be conducted. His achievements demonstrated what disciplined human reason can accomplish. For all these reasons, Isaac Newton deserves his place as one of the most important figures in human history, a man whose life's work continues to shape our world more than 3 centuries after his death. As we bring this journey to its close, Let us return one final time to that cold Christmas morning in 1642, when a tiny, premature infant fought for breath in a farmhouse in Woolsthorpe. No one watching that struggle could have imagined what this child would become or what he would achieve. The midwives who shook their heads and predicted his death, the mother who nursed him through those first precarious months, the grandmother who raised him after his mother remarried. None of them could have foreseen that this difficult, solitary boy would unlock the mathematical secrets of the cosmos and establish the foundations of modern science. There is something almost miraculous about Newton's survival and subsequent achievements. Against all odds, the fragile infant lived. Against all expectations, the abandoned child developed extraordinary intellectual powers. Against the conventional wisdom of his age, he showed that the universe operates according to mathematical laws that human minds can discover and comprehend. Each of these improbable developments led to the next in a chain of events that transformed human civilization. We might wonder, what would have happened if Newton had died in infancy, as everyone expected? Would someone else have made his discoveries? Eventually, probably yes. Science is a collective enterprise, and the problems Newton solved were being worked on by other talented mathematicians and natural philosophers. Leibniz invented calculus independently. Hooke and others were working on gravitational theory. The properties of light would have been discovered by later experimenters, but the discoveries would likely have come more slowly, developed in different ways, and lacked the systematic unity that Newton imposed. The Principia, bringing together celestial mechanics, terrestrial physics, and pure mathematics in one comprehensive framework, was a unique achievement that depended on Newton's particular combination of mathematical power, physical insight, and philosophical vision. No one else in that era possessed all these qualities to the same degree. So, we can be grateful that the premature infant survived, that the abandoned child found intellectual refuge in books and mathematics, that the solitary young man found in natural philosophy a calling worthy of his extraordinary gifts. Newton's difficult personality and troubled relationships make him a less than ideal role model for human conduct, but his intellectual achievements remain inspirational examples of what focused, disciplined, creative thinking can accomplish. He took problems that had baffled humanity for millennia and solved them through a combination of careful observation, ingenious experiment, and powerful mathematical analysis. He showed that seemingly different phenomena, such as falling apples and orbiting planets, could be understood as manifestations of the same underlying principles. He demonstrated that the universe is fundamentally rational, operating according to discoverable laws, rather than arbitrary caprice. These insights have shaped all subsequent science and have influenced how modern people understand their place in the cosmos. We no longer live in the enchanted universe of our ancestors, where spirits animated nature and divine intervention explained unusual events. We live instead in Newton's universe, a vast machine operating according to mathematical law, indifferent to human hopes and fears, but comprehensible to human reason. This is a universe of extraordinary beauty and order, where the same equations that describe a falling apple also describe the orbits of planets and the evolution of galaxies. It is a universe where knowledge is possible, where patient investigation can reveal truths that transcend individual opinion and cultural prejudice. But it is also a universe that can seem cold and meaningless, where human significance must be constructed rather than discovered, where values and purposes must be chosen rather than read off from the natural order. Living in Newton's universe requires a delicate balance. We must cultivate the rational, critical thinking that science demands, while also honouring the dimensions of human experience that science cannot fully capture. We must pursue knowledge rigorously, while remaining humble about what we do not, and perhaps cannot know. We must use our scientific understanding to solve practical problems while recognizing that technical solutions alone cannot address the deeper questions of meaning and value that every human life must confront. Newton's own life exemplifies both the power and the limits of the scientific approach. His physics explained the motions of the heavens, but it could not tell him how to heal his emotional wounds or form satisfying relationships. His mathematics solved problems that had defeated earlier thinkers, but it could not provide guidance about how to live wisely and well. He achieved immortality through his ideas, but he lived a mortal life marked by loneliness and conflict. Perhaps the deepest lesson we can draw from Newton's story is that human excellence takes many forms, and that we need multiple kinds of understanding to live fully. Scientific knowledge is precious and powerful, but so are emotional intelligence, ethical wisdom, aesthetic sensitivity, and spiritual insight. A complete human life requires developing all these capacities, not just the intellectual abilities that our educational systems and professional rewards tend to emphasize. The challenge facing us today, as inheritors of the Newtonian revolution, is to integrate scientific knowledge with these other forms of understanding. We must be rigorous in our thinking while remaining compassionate in our feeling. We must pursue truth fearlessly while acting ethically in light of what we discover. We must use our technological power responsibly, guided by wisdom and care for future generations. These challenges are more difficult than solving differential equations or discovering gravitational laws, but they are no less important. As you drift towards sleep tonight, reflecting on the extraordinary life of Isaac Newton, let these thoughts accompany you into your dreams. Remember the fragile infant who survived against all odds. Remember the abandoned child who found solace in understanding the natural world. Remember the solitary genius who unlocked secrets of the universe that had remained hidden since the dawn of time. Remember, too, that Newton was fully human, marked by flaws and wounds that his brilliant mind could not overcome. His story reminds us that greatness and goodness are not the same, that intellectual achievement and personal fulfillment follow different paths, but his achievements remain inspiring despite his limitations, showing what the human mind can accomplish when it asks the right questions and pursues answers with sufficient dedication and creativity. The universe Newton revealed to us is still the universe we inhabit. The laws he discovered still govern the motions we observe. The methods he established still guide scientific investigation. More than 3 centuries have passed since his death, yet we remain in many ways the children of the Newtonian revolution, living in a world transformed by his insights and shaped by his legacy. May his story inspire you to use your own gifts, whatever they may be, with Newton's dedication and creativity. May it encourage you to ask deep questions about the nature of reality and to pursue answers with rigor and honesty. May it remind you that knowledge is possible, that human reason can penetrate nature's mysteries, that patient investigation can reveal truths that endure. And may it also remind you to cultivate not just intellectual power, but emotional wisdom, not just the ability to analyze, but the capacity to connect. Not just knowledge, but understanding. Sleep well, knowing that we live in a universe that Newton helped us comprehend, a cosmos governed by rational principles that human minds can discover and understand. Sleep well, knowing that each generation stands on the shoulders of those who came before, inheriting their achievements and facing new challenges that will require both their methods and new insights that we must develop for ourselves. And sleep well, knowing that the story continues, that the great ocean of truth still stretches before us, waiting for future minds to explore its depths and discover wonders we cannot yet imagine. The tiny infant who could fit in a quart pot became a giant whose shadow stretches across 3 centuries and will extend far into the future, as long as humans continue to wonder about the cosmos and seek to understand its workings.